The teacher who changed everything. Tommy Tuberville's story. The autumn leaves crunched under the yellow school bus tires as it pulled up to Jefferson High School in Birmingham, Alabama. The morning air carried that crisp October chill that made students pull their hoodies tighter as they shuffled through the entrance doors. Inside room 204, the buzz of teenage chatter filled the space as students settled into their desks, backpacks hitting the floor with familiar thuds. Tommy Tuberville sat in the back corner, his chair tilted back against the wall at a precarious angle. His dark hair fell across his forehead, partially hiding eyes that held a mixture of defiance and something else, something harder to define. At 17, Tommy had already earned a reputation as the kid teachers dreaded having in their classes. His previous English teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had requested a transfer to another school mid-semester, citing irreconcilable differences with classroom management. The classroom itself told the story of Jefferson High's struggles. Water stains marked the ceiling tiles from last spring's roof leaks, and the heating system clanked and wheezed as it fought against the November chill seeping through single-pane windows. Motivational posters hung askew on the walls, their cheerful messages about reaching for the stars and believing in yourself, feeling increasingly hollow in a building where the paint was peeling and the textbooks were a decade out of date. "Yo, Tommy," whispered Jake Martinez from the seat next to him. Jake was a stocky kid with an easy smile who had somehow maintained his friendship with Tommy despite the latter's increasingly volatile behavior. "You hear we're getting some new teacher today? Word is he's from up north somewhere, probably some idealistic college grad who thinks he's gonna save us all." Tommy shrugged, not bothering to lower his chair. The metal legs scraped against the wall with each small movement, creating an irritating rhythm that had driven Mrs. Henderson to distraction in her final weeks at the school. Don't matter where he's from or what he thinks he's gonna do. Give me 2 weeks, and he'll be begging for a transfer just like the rest of them. The prediction came with the weary confidence of someone who had perfected the art of driving away authority figures. In the 2.5 years since Rick had entered their lives, Tommy had watched his mother's face light up whenever teachers called home with positive reports. He'd seen her hope that maybe, with a stable male influence in the house, Tommy might settle down and reach his academic potential. Each subsequent teacher conference that ended in disappointment had dimmed that hope a little more, until finally his mother stopped attending them altogether. Sarah Chen, the class president and honor roll student, sat 3 rows ahead of Tommy, her notebook already open and ready for whatever lesson the new teacher had planned. Sarah had known Tommy since elementary school, back when he'd been a different kid entirely, curious, creative, eager to learn. She remembered him from the science fair in 8th grade, when he'd built an intricate model of the solar system that had captured everyone's attention with its accuracy and attention to detail. That Tommy seemed like a completely different person from the angry, withdrawn teenager who now sat in the back of every classroom, radiating hostility. Marcus Williams occupied the middle of the room, a quiet kid who preferred to observe rather than participate, but who paid careful attention to everything happening around him. Marcus had his own experience with family trauma. His parents' bitter divorce the previous year had left him withdrawn and suspicious of adult promises about stability and security. He recognized something familiar in Tommy's defensive behavior, though he'd never been brave enough to act out the way Tommy did. The classroom door opened with a sharp creak that cut through the morning chatter. A tall man in his mid-30s walked in, carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had traveled many miles, and a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Teacher," in faded letters. He had sandy brown hair, slightly disheveled in a way that suggested someone who had more important things to worry about than perfect grooming, and wore a button-down shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows. What caught everyone's attention wasn't his appearance, it was the way he moved with quiet confidence, like someone who'd seen his share of difficult situations and learned not to be intimidated by them. There was an alertness in his eyes as they swept across the room, cataloging faces and dynamics with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that classroom management began with understanding the students you were trying to reach. "Good morning, class," he said, setting his briefcase down with a deliberate thud that seemed to establish his presence in the room without being confrontational. "I'm Mr. Davidson, and I'll be your English teacher for the rest of the semester." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Students exchanged glances, sizing up this newcomer who would either become another casualty of Tommy Tuberville's classroom warfare or somehow manage to survive until June. There was something different about this one, though, a steadiness that suggested he wasn't easily rattled. Mr. Davidson's gaze swept across the classroom with the careful attention of someone who understood that first impressions were everything in a place like this. He noted Sarah Chen's perfect posture and attentive expression, the way she had her notebook already open and a pen poised to take notes. He observed Jake Martinez's easy slouch and friendly demeanor, the kind of kid who could be an ally or a distraction depending on how you approached him. He catalogued the quiet intensity of Marcus Williams, who sat in the middle of the room like someone trying to remain invisible while still participating in his own education. And then his eyes reached the back corner where Tommy sat with his chair tilted back against the wall, his arms crossed, and his expression challenging anyone who dared to try to connect with him. When their gazes met for a brief moment, Tommy expected to see the usual mixture of concern and resignation that teachers got when they realized who he was. The warnings from other faculty members, the stories about his behavior, the sense that they were facing an impossible task. Instead, Mr. Davidson simply nodded once, as if acknowledging an equal, and continued his visual survey of the class. It was such a small gesture that most students missed it entirely, but Tommy noticed. In that single nod, there was no fear, no judgment, no sense of a challenge being issued or accepted, just recognition. "Before we get started with today's lesson," Mr. Davidson said, walking to the whiteboard and writing his name in clear, confident letters, "I want you all to know something about me. I grew up in Detroit, in a neighborhood where the schools had bars on the windows and metal detectors at the doors. Gang activity was common, resources were scarce, and a lot of kids fell through the cracks before they ever had a chance to find out what they were capable of achieving." He turned to face the class, leaning back against his desk, with his arms crossed in a posture that was relaxed but attentive. "I've taught in inner-city schools in Chicago, where I had to break up knife fights in the hallway. I've taught in rural schools in Montana, where some of my students drove 40 miles each way just to get to class, often in pickup trucks held together with duct tape and prayer. I've taught in wealthy suburban schools in Connecticut, where the pressure to achieve was so intense that kids were having nervous breakdowns by age 15. A few students shifted in their seats, beginning to pay attention despite themselves. This wasn't the typical introduction they'd heard from new teachers. No talk about making learning fun or helping them reach their potential. This was something raw, more honest, more real than the educational platitudes they'd grown accustomed to hearing. I've seen kids who were dealing with poverty, abuse, addiction, family breakdown, academic failure, social isolation, and every other challenge you can imagine," Mr. Davidson continued. "Some of them made it through high school and went on to college, careers, families of their own. Some of them didn't make it through for reasons that had nothing to do with their intelligence or potential and everything to do with circumstances beyond their control. But every single one of them taught me something important about resilience, about the human capacity for growth, and about the difference between giving up on someone and giving them space to figure things out." Sarah Chen raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Davidson, What made you decide to come to Jefferson High? I mean, after teaching in all those other places, what brought you here specifically? Excellent question, Sarah. Mr. Davidson had clearly done his homework, already knowing his students' names from their files and previous teachers' notes. Sometimes you hear about a place that needs help, and you feel called to be part of the solution rather than just complaining about the problem. Birmingham has a rich history of people standing up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy or popular or safe. The civil rights movement taught us that real change happens when individuals decide they're willing to take personal risks for the sake of justice and human dignity. He paused, looking around the room with the same careful attention he'd shown when he first entered. Plus, I heard that this particular class had driven away its previous teacher, and I've always been curious about students who are smart enough and determined enough to outlast the adults who are supposed to be teaching them. That takes a special kind of intelligence and persistence. Tommy made a sound somewhere between a snort and a laugh, the first response he'd shown to anything Mr. Davidson had said. Yeah, right. You're here because nobody else wanted the job after Mrs. Henderson bailed. They probably told you it was a challenge, made it sound like some noble mission, but really you're just the only teacher desperate enough to take a classroom full of lost causes and problem kids. Oh, the words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, sharp and deliberately provocative. This was it. The moment when Tommy would establish his dominance over yet another teacher, when he would prove that his reputation was well earned, and that anyone who thought they could reach him was deluding themselves about both his character and their own abilities. Students held their breath, waiting to see how Mr. Davidson would handle this direct challenge to his authority, his competence, and his character. Some teachers would have responded with anger, asserting their control through volume and threats of punishment. Others would have tried to deflect with humor or ignore the comment entirely, hoping it would pass without escalation. A few might have attempted to turn the moment into a teachable lesson about respect and appropriate classroom behavior. Mr. Davidson did none of these things. Instead, he studied Tommy for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive or angry. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and considered, as if Tommy had just shared an interesting perspective rather than delivered a calculated insult designed to provoke a reaction. You know what, Tommy? You might be absolutely right about that. Maybe I am here because it's the only job I could get. Maybe the principal did have to scrape the bottom of the barrel to find someone willing to take on a class that had driven away its previous teacher. Maybe I am just another idealistic educator who's going to crash and burn when reality doesn't match my expectations. Tommy's chair came down to the floor with a sharp bang that echoed through the suddenly silent classroom. This wasn't the response he'd expected, and the unexpected honesty had thrown him completely off balance. Teachers weren't supposed to admit weakness or uncertainty. They were supposed to defend their authority and competence, giving him something to fight against. But here's what I know for sure, Mr. Davidson continued, never breaking eye contact with Tommy. I'm here now in this room with all of you for however long it lasts, and while I'm here, we're going to do something meaningful together. We're going to read stories about people who faced impossible situations and found ways to survive them with their humanity intact. We're going to talk about courage and resilience and the difference between giving up and making strategic retreats. We're going to explore what it means to maintain hope when everything around you seems designed to destroy it. He moved away from his desk, walking closer to where Tommy sat, his movement casual but purposeful. We're going to examine how people rebuild trust after it's been broken, how they find strength when they feel weak, how they create meaning out of experiences that seem senseless and cruel. Whether you participate in that process or spend your time trying to sabotage it is entirely up to you, Tommy, but it's going to happen either way. Tommy's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists on his desktop. The calm certainty in Mr. Davidson's voice was more unsettling than anger would have been. Easy words to say when you don't know anything about the real world. Let's see if you're still talking about courage and resilience and hope when you've been here long enough to figure out that some situations don't have happy endings. Some people don't get rescued. Some stories just end badly, no matter how much courage the characters show or how hard they fight. You might be absolutely right about that too, Mr. Davidson said quietly, his continued willingness to acknowledge Tommy's points rather than arguing with them, creating a dynamic that neither student nor teacher had experienced before. Some stories do end badly. Some people don't get the help they need. Some situations are too broken to be fixed, no matter how much effort people put into trying to repair them. The philosophical honesty was disarming in ways that Tommy couldn't have anticipated. He'd prepared for defensiveness, for inspirational speeches about the power of positive thinking, for the kind of naive optimism that he'd learned to destroy with surgical precision. But Mr. Davidson's willingness to acknowledge the possibility of failure, the reality of unfairness, the existence of genuinely tragic circumstances, left Tommy without his usual weapons of cynicism and sarcasm. But, Mr. Davidson continued, I've also learned that stories aren't over until they're over. And even when they end badly, the courage people show along the way still matters. The love they give and receive still matters. The connections they make, even if those connections don't last forever, still matter. Sometimes the point isn't to guarantee a happy ending. Sometimes the point is just to make sure you can look at yourself in the mirror and know you didn't give up on what was important. The bell rang, ending the period before Tommy could formulate a response to this unexpected philosophical challenge. Students gathered their belongings in the awkward silence that follows an intense, unresolved conversation, stealing glances at Tommy to gauge his reaction to this teacher who refused to play by the usual rules of engagement. As they filed out, Tommy deliberately knocked over his desk chair, letting it clatter to the floor in a gesture that had become his trademark way of expressing displeasure. But unlike previous incidents, this felt more perfunctory than passionate, as if he was going through the motions of being defiant because it was expected of him, not because he felt the anger that usually fueled such acts. Mr. Davidson watched him go, then quietly walked over and picked up the chair, setting it upright with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout the entire interaction. Sarah Chen lingered by the door, clearly wanting to say something, but uncertain about how to proceed. Mr. Davidson, she said softly, glancing toward the hallway to make sure Tommy was out of earshot. Just so you know, Tommy wasn't always like this. When we were younger, he was actually really smart and creative. He won second place at the science fair in 8th grade with this amazing solar system model that he spent months working on. All the planets rotated around the sun at the correct speeds, and he'd programmed lights to show how the temperature changed based on distance from the sun. Mr. Davidson looked up from arranging the chair, his expression interested rather than surprised. What happened to change that? Do you know anything about his current living situation, family structure, support systems? Sarah shook her head. He doesn't talk about his personal life much anymore. But Jake Martinez might know more. They've been friends since middle school, though even that relationship seems strained lately. She paused, then added quietly, I think Tommy's in real trouble, Mr. Davidson. Like, more than just typical teenage rebellion. There's something desperate about the way he acts now, like he's fighting for his life or something. Mr. Davidson nodded, filing away this information for future reference. Thank you for telling me this, Sarah. I appreciate you looking out for your classmate, even when he's been difficult to be around. As the classroom emptied completely, Mr. Davidson sat down at his desk and opened his briefcase. Inside, along with lesson plans and grading materials, was a small framed photo of a teenage boy with the same sandy brown hair as Mr. Davidson, wearing a football uniform and grinning at the camera with the unconscious confidence of youth. The boy in the photo looked to be about 16 or 17, roughly the same age as Tommy. Mr. Davidson touched the frame gently, his fingers tracing the edge of the glass, as if the gesture could somehow bridge the distance between past and present. This photo had traveled with him from classroom to classroom, from Detroit to Chicago to Montana to Connecticut, and now to Birmingham. It served as both inspiration and reminder. Inspiration to keep reaching for students who seemed unreachable, and reminder of why that work mattered more than his own comfort or career advancement. The boy in the photo was Michael Davidson, Mr. Davidson's younger brother, who had died in a car accident during his senior year of high school. Michael had been the kind of student teachers loved: engaged, respectful, academically successful, socially well-adjusted. But in the months before his death, he'd confided in his older brother about classmates who were struggling. Kids who seemed angry and lost and beyond help. Michael had worried about them, had tried to reach out to them, had wondered aloud whether anyone was really seeing them or just writing them off as troublemakers. "Promise me something," Michael had said during one of their last conversations as they sat on the porch of their childhood home in Detroit. "If you ever become a teacher like you're planning, promise me you won't give up on the angry kids. Promise me you'll remember that sometimes the kids who fight the hardest are the ones who need help the most." It was a promise Mr. Davidson had kept through years of challenging classroom experiences, through students who seemed determined to push him to his breaking point, through administrative pressures and budget cuts and all the other obstacles that made teaching in public schools feel like an uphill battle. Every time he encountered a student like Tommy Tuberville, intelligent but angry, wounded but still fighting, he heard Michael's voice reminding him to look deeper, to see past the behavior to the pain that was driving it. Outside in the hallway, Tommy slammed his locker door with enough force to make other students jump and look in his direction. The sound echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot, causing a brief pause in the constant flow of teenage conversation that filled the corridors between classes. Jake Martinez caught up with him, slightly out of breath from hurrying to keep pace with Tommy's angry stride. "Dude, that was intense. You really showed him who's boss. Did you see the look on his face when you called him out about being desperate for a job?" But Tommy wasn't feeling the usual satisfaction that came from rattling a new teacher. Something about the way Mr. Davidson had looked at him, not with fear or frustration or the resigned disappointment he'd come to expect from adults, but with a kind of calm recognition, had thrown him completely off balance. "Yeah," Tommy muttered, shouldering his backpack with more force than necessary. "Whatever. He'll be gone soon enough. They always are." Jake frowned, noting the edge of something that sounded almost like sadness in his friend's voice. Maybe this one will be different. He seemed pretty calm about the whole thing. "They all seem calm at first," Tommy replied, his voice taking on the bitter tone that had become his default whenever discussing adults in positions of authority. "They come in with their inspirational speeches and their belief that they're going to be the one who makes a difference. Then they figure out that some kids can't be saved, some situations can't be fixed, and some problems are bigger than whatever they learned in education school." But even as he said the words, Tommy couldn't quite shake the memory of Mr. Davidson's steady gaze, or the way the man had spoken about courage and resilience, as if these weren't just abstract concepts, but lived realities that he understood from personal experience. There had been something in his voice when he talked about stories not being over until they were over, something that suggested he knew what it felt like to face situations that seemed hopeless. It was confusing and unsettling in ways Tommy couldn't articulate. He'd spent months perfecting his technique for driving away unwanted adult attention, but Mr. Davidson seemed almost interested in Tommy's hostility rather than threatened by it. as if Tommy's anger was information worth understanding rather than behavior that needed to be eliminated. 3 weeks passed and Mr. Davidson had settled into the rhythm of Jefferson High School with surprising ease. His teaching style was unlike anything the students had experienced before. He treated literature like it was alive, relevant, and worth fighting for. When they read To Kill a Mockingbird, he didn't just discuss the themes of justice and prejudice in abstract terms that would be forgotten as soon as the test was over. Instead, he brought in newspaper articles about current civil rights cases, played recordings of actual court proceedings from the 1960s and compared them to modern legal battles, and challenged students to connect Scout Finch's gradual awakening to moral complexity with their own experiences of witnessing injustice in their daily lives. He asked them to consider how Harper Lee's portrayal of mob mentality related to social media pile-ons they'd witnessed online, how Atticus Finch's struggle with doing what was right versus what was popular connected to peer pressure they faced in their own lives. The approach was working with most of his students. Sarah Chen found herself staying after class to continue discussions about moral ambiguity and the complexity of heroism, conversations that extended far beyond the requirements of the curriculum into genuine intellectual exploration. Marcus Williams, who had barely spoken in English class for 2 years, began raising his hand to share thoughtful observations about character motivation and thematic development. His insights often surprising his classmates with their depth and sophistication. Even the typically disinterested athletes started engaging with the material when Mr. Davidson connected Atticus Finch's struggle against social pressure to their own experiences with team dynamics, hazing rituals, and the pressure to conform to group expectations, even when those expectations conflicted with personal values, all except Tommy Tuberville. If anything, Tommy's behavior had escalated in response to Mr. Davidson's patient consistency. He arrived late to class every single day, usually interrupting Mr. Davidson mid-sentence with his entrance. The interruptions were never dramatic enough to warrant sending him to the principal's office, but they were perfectly timed to disrupt the flow of discussion and draw attention away from whatever academic content was being covered. During class discussions, Tommy made sarcastic comments under his breath, just loud enough for other students to hear, but quiet enough to make directly confronting him awkward and disruptive to the learning environment. His comments were often intelligent critiques of the material being discussed, but they were delivered with such cynicism and hostility that they poisoned the atmosphere rather than contributing to genuine academic discourse. When Mr. Davidson assigned group work, Tommy either refused to participate entirely, sitting in sullen silence while his group members worked around him, or he dominated the conversation so completely that his partners gave up trying to contribute and simply let him do all the work. He would then complete assignments with obvious resentment and minimal effort, turning in work that met the technical requirements while making it clear that he considered the entire exercise a waste of time. The pattern was clearly designed to test Mr. Davidson's patience and push him toward the kind of explosive confrontation that had driven away previous teachers. Tommy seemed to be conducting a systematic experiment in finding Mr. Davidson's breaking point, escalating his behavior incrementally to see how much disruption the man would tolerate before either giving up on him entirely or losing his temper in a way that would justify Tommy's cynical worldview about adult reliability and commitment. But Mr. Davidson refused to take the bait. Instead of escalating in response to Tommy's provocations, he maintained the same steady presence he'd shown on the first day, acknowledging Tommy's contributions when they were constructive, ignoring his disruptions when they were minor, and addressing his behavior directly when it interfered with other students' learning, all without losing his composure or taking Tommy's actions personally. This refusal to engage in the power struggle Tommy was trying to create seemed to frustrate the teenager more than any punishment could have. He'd learned to navigate adult anger, adult disappointment, even adult indifference. But Mr. Davidson's consistent, calm attention was something entirely new in Tommy's experience with authority figures, and he didn't have established strategies for dealing with it. Tommy arrived to English class 15 minutes late, as had become his routine, but there was something different about his demeanor that morning. His usual calculated defiance had been replaced by something rawer and more volatile. His face was flushed from the cold, but his eyes held a kind of desperate energy that suggested he was operating on very little sleep and possibly not much food. "Sorry I'm late," he announced to the room as he made his way to his seat, his heavy boots echoing loudly on the linoleum floor. "Had some family business to take care of. You know how it is. Sometimes real life gets in the way of education, Mr. Davidson paused in his explanation of moral courage, the day's topic, and watched Tommy settle into his seat with deliberate slowness, clearly trying to maximize the disruption. Tommy leaned back in his chair, balancing it on two legs in the precarious position that had become his signature pose. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth, but there was something forced about it, as if he was working harder than usual to maintain his facade of indifference. "Yeah, I can think of one," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Teachers who quit mid-semester because they can't handle real students with real problems. Takes real moral courage to abandon your job and your students when things get tough, doesn't it? I mean, it's so much easier to run away to a different school where the kids are more cooperative and grateful. The words hit their target with precision, referencing not just Mrs. Henderson's departure, but also the broader pattern of adult abandonment that had clearly shaped Tommy's worldview. The classroom fell into the kind of silence that follows a verbal bomb being dropped, students recognizing that Tommy had just crossed a line that went far beyond his usual disruptive behavior. Sarah Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands clenched in her lap as she fought the urge to defend Mrs. Henderson, who had genuinely tried to help Tommy before. The stress of dealing with his behavior had contributed to her decision to transfer schools. "Tommy, that's not fair. Mrs. Henderson had her reasons for leaving, and they weren't just about..." "Weren't about what?" Tommy interrupted, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "About me being too difficult to deal with. About the administration not supporting teachers who have to handle problem students. About her realizing that some kids aren't worth the effort it takes to help them." The pain underneath his anger was becoming more visible now, bleeding through the facade of indifference he'd worked so hard to maintain. Other students in the classroom began to recognize that Tommy's hostility wasn't just random troublemaking. It was coming from a place of deep hurt and disappointment that went far beyond typical adolescent rebellion. "Don't," Tommy said, his voice sharp with warning as he brought his chair down to the floor with a bang that made several students flinch. "Don't try to psychoanalyze me, okay? Don't try to turn this into some teachable moment about emotional intelligence or whatever psychology garbage they taught you in education school. You don't know anything about me or my life or what I've been through." "You're absolutely right," Mr. Davidson agreed, his admission causing Tommy to pause in the middle of building up to what was clearly going to be a major outburst. "I don't know much about your life or what you've been through, but I can see that you're angry about something much bigger than literature discussions or classroom management policies. And I can see that you're in pain, even though you're working very hard to hide it behind aggression and sarcasm." Tommy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back with enough force to send it rolling into the wall behind him. His hands were shaking slightly, whether from anger or cold or something else entirely, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. "You want to know what I'm angry about?" he demanded, his voice rising to a level that could probably be heard in adjacent classrooms. You really want to understand why I don't buy into your inspirational teacher routine, why I don't believe in your speeches about courage and resilience and never giving up? Yes, I do, Mr. Davidson replied simply, his calm directness cutting through Tommy's building hysteria. The honest answer seemed to catch Tommy off guard. He'd expected defensiveness, platitudes, maybe even anger in return. But Mr. Davidson's genuine curiosity and willingness to listen seemed to disarm him temporarily, leaving him scrambling to maintain his emotional armor. I'm angry because people like you come in here acting like you care, like you're going to make some big difference in our lives, like you're the hero teacher who's going to turn everything around with the power of literature and believing in us. Tommy's voice was growing louder with each word, months of suppressed frustration finally finding an outlet. You talk about moral courage and standing up for what's right and never abandoning the people who need you. But where's your moral courage going to be when the administration pressures you to just pass me along to the next grade, whether I've learned anything or not? Where's your commitment going to be when you realize that helping me requires more time and energy than you signed up for? So excuse me if I don't get all excited about your moral courage lesson, he continued, his voice taking on its familiar sarcastic edge as he tried to rebuild his defenses. Some of us live in the real world, where the good guys don't always win and the heroes don't stick around long enough to see how the story actually ends. Some of us have learned that trusting people just gives them more power to hurt you when they decide you're too much work to deal with. Mr. Davidson nodded slowly, as if Tommy had just shared something profound, rather than delivered what was clearly intended as a hostile attack designed to drive him away. That's a fair point, Tommy. Heroes in books do have it easier than people in real life. They get to have their big dramatic moments of courage, and then the story ends, credits roll, everyone goes home feeling inspired about the triumph of good over evil. He moved away from his desk, walking closer to where Tommy stood, but maintaining enough distance to avoid making the teenager feel cornered or threatened. We don't usually get to see what happens next in those stories, whether the heroes keep being brave when it gets boring, or when nobody's watching, or when the cost of courage is higher than they expected to pay. We don't see them dealing with mundane problems like paying bills, or managing relationships, or figuring out how to keep showing up when they're exhausted. Tommy's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The philosophical approach was throwing him off balance again, forcing him to engage with ideas rather than simply rejecting emotional appeals. Easy words to say when you're the adult with the secure job and the ability to leave whenever you want. Let's see if you're still talking about choosing to show up when you've been here long enough to figure out that some situations don't have happy endings, that some people are too broken to fix, and that all your good intentions don't mean anything when the real world gets in the way. You might be right about that too, Mr. Davidson said quietly, his continued willingness to acknowledge Tommy's points rather than arguing with them, creating a dynamic that neither student nor teacher had experienced before. Maybe I will decide it's too hard and leave. Maybe I'm just setting myself up for disappointment by believing I can make a difference here. Maybe I'll turn out to be just another adult who makes promises about caring and then disappears when things get complicated. But, Mr. Davidson continued, I'd rather risk disappointment by trying to care about something difficult than spend my life protecting myself from the possibility of failure. I'd rather bet on the chance that some stories can have better endings than accept that all stories are destined to end badly. The stare down between teacher and student stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Around them, the rest of the class watched in fascination and growing concern as their most disruptive classmate teetered on the edge of either complete breakdown or breakthrough. Finally, Tommy grabbed his backpack and started moving toward the door. his movement sharp and aggressive. "Yeah, well, we'll see how long that attitude lasts when you realize what you've actually signed up for." "Where are you going?" Mr. Davidson asked, his voice calm but firm. Tommy paused with his hand on the doorknob, his back still turned to the classroom. "Somewhere that doesn't require listening to fairy tales about courage and heroes and people who keep their promises." "Tommy." Mr. Davidson's voice stopped him again, though he didn't turn around. "Whatever's going on in your life that's making you this angry, whatever's making you feel like you have to handle everything by yourself, you don't have to carry it alone. There are people here who want to help if you'll let them." For just a moment, Tommy's shoulders seemed to sag slightly, as if the weight he was carrying had briefly become visible to everyone in the room. His hand tightened on the doorknob, and for a second it seemed like he might turn around and say something real, something honest, something that would bridge the gap between his pain and the help being offered. Then he straightened up, pulled open the door, and delivered his parting shot without looking back. "Yeah, well, carrying it alone is all I know how to do. It's all anyone's ever taught me how to do." The door slammed shut behind him with enough force to awe. The week following Tommy's dramatic exit from English class passed in a strange, tense quiet. He continued to attend Mr. Davidson's class, but his behavior had shifted from actively disruptive to passively resistant. He arrived on time but said nothing. He completed assignments but turned in work that was technically acceptable while being deliberately superficial. It was as if he was conducting an experiment in minimal compliance, testing whether Mr. Davidson would push him to engage more fully or accept this limited participation as adequate. Mr. Davidson, for his part, seemed to understand the significance of this change in Tommy's behavior. Rather than pressuring him to return to the level of engagement he'd shown during previous outbursts, he allowed Tommy the space to process whatever internal conflict their confrontation had triggered. When Tommy turned in a perfunctory essay about symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird, Mr. Davidson returned it with detailed, thoughtful comments that treated Tommy's shallow analysis as a starting point rather than a disappointment. "Your observation about the mockingbird symbol being too obvious is interesting," he'd written in the margins. "Can you explore what Lee might have been trying to achieve by choosing such an obvious symbol? Sometimes authors make deliberate choices that seem simple on the surface, but serve more complex purposes. What do you think she was really trying to communicate to her readers?" The comment suggested that Mr. Davidson saw potential in Tommy's work, even when Tommy himself was trying to demonstrate his indifference to the subject matter. It was a teaching approach that several other faculty members found perplexing. Why invest so much time and energy in a student who was clearly resistant to learning? But Mr. Davidson seemed committed to treating Tommy's education as worthwhile, regardless of Tommy's own attitude toward it. Other students in the class began to notice the dynamics playing out between their most problematic classmate and their new teacher. Sarah Chen found herself paying close attention to the subtle ways Mr. Davidson continued to include Tommy in class discussions, asking him direct questions even when Tommy's body language suggested he wanted to be left alone, treating his minimal responses as contributions worth building upon rather than signs of disrespect. Jake Martinez, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly worried about his friend's mental state. Tommy had always been moody and difficult, but there was something different about him lately, something that went beyond typical teenage angst into territory that felt genuinely concerning. He'd lost weight noticeably over the past month, his clothes hanging loose on his frame in a way that suggested he wasn't eating regularly. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened, and he moved through the hallways with the careful deliberation of someone who was exhausted but trying to hide it. Tommy Tuberville had been absent for the entire week before the storm, marked down for family obligations according to the attendance office, but Mr. Davidson had learned enough about his students to know that official explanations didn't always tell the whole story. He'd tried calling the number on file, but it had been disconnected, A visit to the guidance counselor had yielded only a shrug and a comment about how some kids fall through the cracks when family situations become unstable. When Tommy finally walked into the classroom that Monday morning, Mr. Davidson's concern deepened immediately. The teenager looked like he'd aged years in the span of 2 weeks. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, making them appear sunken and hollow. His clothes hung loose on his frame, as if he'd lost significant weight, and there was a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. Most alarming was the emptiness in his expression. Not anger or defiance, but a kind of vacant despair that suggested someone who had reached the end of their emotional reserves. "Welcome back, Tommy," Mr. Davidson said, as Tommy made his way to his seat with careful, deliberate steps. "I hope everything's okay at home." Tommy's response was a bitter laugh that made several students turn to look at him with obvious concern. "Yeah, everything's just perfect. Really couldn't be better. Thanks for asking." The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut, but underneath it, Mr. Davidson heard something else. Exhaustion so profound it seemed to radiate from Tommy's entire being. As the class settled in and Mr. Davidson began the day's lesson on character development in literature, he kept glancing toward the back corner where Tommy sat staring out the window, clearly not listening to anything being said. Halfway through the period, as Mr. Davidson was explaining how authors reveal character through dialogue and action, Tommy interrupted with a voice that cut through the discussion like a blade. "This is such garbage," he said, his words sharp and bitter. "All this analyzing and picking apart what characters do and why they do it. You act like there's some deep meaning to everything, like people's actions always make sense and follow some logical pattern." Mr. Davidson paused, recognizing immediately that this wasn't just another typical disruptive comment. There was something raw and desperate in Tommy's voice, something that went far beyond classroom rebellion into genuine anguish. "What do you mean by that, Tommy?" Mr. Davidson asked, his voice gentle but direct. "I mean, sometimes people do things for no good reason," Tommy said, his voice growing louder with each word. "Sometimes they make promises they don't intend to keep. Sometimes they say they love you, and then they just leave, and all your literary analysis and character development doesn't explain any of it, because people are just selfish and cruel, and they don't care who they hurt as long as they get what they want." The classroom had gone completely silent. Sarah Chen looked like she wanted to say something comforting, but she seemed to sense that Tommy was beyond the reach of well-meaning platitudes. Jake Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing that his friend was revealing pain that went far deeper than he'd understood. Mr. Davidson set down his book and gave Tommy his full attention. "That sounds like it comes from personal experience, Tommy. Do you want to talk about it?" "No, I don't want to talk about it," Tommy exploded, jumping to his feet so suddenly that his chair toppled backward and hit the floor with a crash. "I don't want to analyze it or find the deeper meaning or figure out what it teaches us about the human condition. I just want it to stop hurting so much." The words hung in the air like a challenge, raw and honest, in a way that took everyone's breath away. For the first time since he'd started disrupting classes, Tommy looked vulnerable rather than dangerous. His hands were shaking visibly now, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. Mr. Davidson took a step closer, his movement slow and non-threatening. "Tommy, what happened while you were away from school? What's making you hurt this badly?" "Nothing happened," Tommy said, but his voice cracked on the words, betraying the lie. "That's the whole point. Nothing ever happens the way it's supposed to. People say they'll be there for you, and then they're not. They say family matters, and then they prove it doesn't. They say they love you, and then they show you exactly how much that love is worth when things get difficult." He stopped himself, seeming to realize how much he was revealing. But it was too late. The pain in his voice had already told the story his words were trying to hide. They say what, Tommy? Mr. Davidson's voice was gentle, encouraging. Tommy looked around the classroom, suddenly seeming to remember that he had an audience of his peers. His face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. "Forget it," he muttered. "Just forget I said anything. Let's get back to analyzing fictional characters who make sense because real people are too complicated and disappointing to understand." But Mr. Davidson wasn't willing to let the moment pass. "Tommy, I know we've had our differences, but I can see that you're in real pain right now. Whatever's happening in your life that's making you feel this way, maybe we can find a way to help." He grabbed his backpack and started moving toward the door. But this time, Mr. Davidson stepped into his path, not blocking him, but making it clear that leaving wouldn't be as easy as it had been before. "Tommy, stop. Just stop running away every time something gets difficult." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. His face went white, then flushed again with anger so intense it seemed to radiate heat. "Running away? You think I'm running away? You don't know anything about what I've been through. You don't know what it's like to have everyone you're supposed to be able to count on just disappear when you need them most." "Then tell me," Mr. Davidson said simply. "Help me understand what you're dealing with." For a moment, it seemed like Tommy might actually open up. His anger wavered, and something almost hopeful flickered in his eyes. But then he seemed to catch himself, remembering all the times he'd been disappointed by adults who had promised to listen and help. "Why should I?" he demanded. "So you can feel better about yourself, so you can tell yourself you made a difference before you move on to your next teaching job and your next group of kids to save. So you can add another inspiring story to your collection about reaching troubled students." Mr. Davidson felt the accusation like a punch to the gut, partly because he recognized there might be some truth to it. How many schools had he worked at over the years? How many students had he tried to help before moving on to new challenges when the work became too difficult or emotionally draining? "Maybe you're right," he admitted, his honesty catching Tommy completely off guard. "Maybe I have moved around too much. Maybe I have told myself I was helping when really I was just looking for something that was missing in my own life. Maybe I am just another adult who makes promises about caring and then disappears when the reality turns out to be messier than expected." The vulnerability in Mr. Davidson's voice seemed to disarm Tommy's anger temporarily. He'd expected defensiveness or reassurance, not this kind of honest self-reflection. "But here's what I know," Mr. Davidson continued. "Right now, in this moment, you're in pain, and I'm here. I can't promise I'll be here forever, and I can't promise I won't make mistakes or disappoint you in ways I can't even imagine yet. But I can promise I'm here now, and I'm willing to listen to whatever you need to say, for as long as you need to say it." Tommy stared at him, his internal struggle visible on his face. Around the classroom, his classmates watched in fascination and concern as their most disruptive peer teetered on the edge of either complete breakdown or breakthrough. "You really want to know what happened?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You really want to understand why I don't believe in your literary heroes and happy endings anymore?" "Yes, I do." Tommy looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of his classmates who had watched him act out for months without really understanding why. Sarah Chen nodded encouragingly. Jake Martinez looked genuinely concerned for the first time since Tommy could remember. Even the students who typically avoided him were leaning forward, ready to listen. He walked back to his overturned chair, picking it up and setting it upright, but instead of sitting down, he stood behind it like a shield between himself and the rest of the class. "You want to know what I learned? I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the first ones to abandon you when loving you becomes inconvenient." And with those words, Tommy Tuberville began to tell a story that would shatter every assumption his classmates had made about strength, family, and what it really meant to survive when the people you trusted most proved unworthy of that trust. Tommy stood behind his chair, gripping the back of it with white knuckles, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The November afternoon light filtered through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor and highlighting the exhaustion etched into every line of his 17-year-old face. Around him, 27 classmates sat in absolute silence, sensing that they were about to hear something that would change how they understood not just Tommy, but themselves and their own assumptions about family, loyalty, and survival. Mr. Davidson had moved to the side of the classroom, giving Tommy the physical and emotional space he needed while remaining close enough to offer support if the teenager needed it. The teacher's own experience with loss and abandonment had taught him to recognize the signs of someone preparing to share trauma that had never been spoken aloud before. "My biological father left when I was 8 years old," Tommy began, his voice steady but hollow, like someone reciting facts that had been carved into his memory with devastating precision. "Not gradually, not after months of fighting with my mom, not because of some dramatic crisis. He just decided one day that being a father was harder than he'd expected, so he packed his stuff while I was at school and was gone when I got home." Sarah Chen's hands were already clasped tightly in her lap, recognizing the controlled way Tommy was speaking as the voice of someone who had learned to protect themselves from their own pain by treating it like a story that had happened to someone else. "He left a note," Tommy continued, his voice taking on the flat, emotionless tone that people use when recounting trauma they've had to explain too many times. 2 pages long, full of explanations about how he needed to find himself and how he wasn't ready for the responsibility of family life. As if 8 years of being my dad hadn't been enough time to figure out whether he wanted the job. "My mum found me in the kitchen reading that note when she got home from work," Tommy said, his voice softening slightly as he talked about his mother. "I'll never forget the look on her face when she realized what had happened. It was like someone had physically hit her, but worse, because physical pain eventually stops hurting." Jake Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, beginning to understand why his friend had always deflected questions about his family with sarcasm and subject changes. "Mom tried to keep it together for my sake," Tommy continued. "She worked 2 jobs to keep us in our house, cleaned office buildings at night and worked as a medical receptionist during the day. She was exhausted all the time, but she'd still come home and help me with homework, still ask me about my day, still try to make birthdays and holidays special, even though money was always tight." His voice grew warmer as he talked about his mother, revealing a tenderness that none of his classmates had ever seen from him before. It was clear that whatever anger and cynicism had developed in Tommy's worldview, his love for his mother remained pure and uncomplicated. Mr. Davidson watched Tommy carefully, noting the way the teenager's breathing remained steady as long as he was talking about the early years with his mother, but became more shallow and rapid as he approached what was clearly the more difficult part of his story. Tommy paused, looking out the window at the grey November sky, as if gathering strength from some internal source. When he continued, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood that sharing this information would change how people saw him forever. But Rick was persistent in a way that seemed romantic rather than pushy. He brought her flowers, asked about me and my school activities, treated her like she was worth pursuing and deserving of attention. He seemed different from my dad, more mature, more stable, more committed to the idea of family. Sarah Chen wiped away tears that had started flowing, despite her efforts to maintain composure. She was beginning to understand that Tommy's story was going to get much worse before it got better, and she wasn't sure she was emotionally prepared to hear it. Rick had a good job, owned his own house, seemed like the kind of person who didn't make promises he couldn't keep, Tommy continued, his expression growing more complicated as conflicted emotions played across his face. Mom was happier than I'd seen her since before Dad left. Rick took us on family vacations, Real vacations, not just day trips to free museums or state parks. He helped me with school projects, came to my football games, even though I spent most of the time sitting on the bench. He treated me like I was his own son from the very beginning. The love and gratitude in Tommy's voice made what everyone knew was coming even more heartbreaking. Marcus Williams, who had his own experience with family dissolution, recognized the particular pain of remembering good times that had been poisoned by later betrayal. Mr. Davidson positioned himself where he could intervene quickly if Tommy became too overwhelmed to continue. He recognized the signs of someone reliving trauma rather than simply recounting it, and he wanted to be prepared to offer support if the teenager needed it. Rick adopted me legally when I was 15, Tommy continued, his voice growing even quieter as he spoke about what should have been one of the happiest moments of his life. I took his last name, Tuberville. I thought it meant something real, you know? I thought it meant he was choosing to be my father, that he was making a permanent commitment to our family that couldn't be undone by changing his mind or deciding things were too difficult. The pain in Tommy's voice was becoming more evident with each word, and several students in the classroom were openly crying now as they began to understand the full scope of what Tommy was about to reveal. Jake Martinez looked like he wanted to be physically sick, finally understanding the magnitude of betrayal his friend had experienced. For 2 years, everything was good, Tommy said, his voice taking on a dreamlike quality as he remembered what had been the happiest period of his life. Better than good, actually. Rick helped me prepare for college applications, attended every single parent-teacher conference with Mom, talked about family vacations we'd take after I graduated. He and Mom seemed really happy together. They talked about growing old together, about watching me get married and have kids of my own someday. Tommy's grip on the chair tightened, his knuckles white with the effort of maintaining his composure as he approached the most difficult part of his story. Then 3 weeks ago, Mom started feeling really tired and weak, he continued, his voice becoming mechanical and clinical, as if distancing himself emotionally was the only way he could continue. At first, we thought it was just stress from work, or maybe a bad flu that was taking longer than usual to clear up. But when the symptoms didn't improve after 2 weeks, she went to see her doctor. The shift in Tommy's tone signaled that the story was about to take its darkest turn. Students who had been leaning forward in their seats now sat back slightly, as if bracing themselves for impact. The doctor found a lump in her breast during the examination, Tommy said, his voice completely flat now, devoid of any emotion. They did more tests, ultrasounds, biopsies, CT scans. The diagnosis was breast cancer, stage 3. Treatable, the doctor said, but it was going to require surgery, months of chemotherapy, radiation treatments. She was going to be really sick for a long time, and she wouldn't be able to work during treatment. Several students in the classroom were crying openly now, understanding not just the medical crisis Tommy's family was facing, but the emotional trauma of having to deal with it during his senior year of high school. The night we got the diagnosis, Mom and I sat in the hospital parking lot crying together, Tommy continued, his voice remaining eerily calm despite the devastating content of his words. She was scared about the cancer, obviously, but she was also worried about money and how we were going to manage everything. The medical bills were going to be enormous, even with insurance. I told her we'd figure it out together, that we'd gotten through hard times before, and we could do it again. He looked directly at Mr. Davidson as he continued, his eyes holding a challenge and a question at the same time. Rick was working late that night, so Mom and I drove home to tell him the news. Mom was nervous about how he'd react, not because she thought he'd be unsupportive, but because she knew how much he worried about her, and she was afraid the diagnosis would scare him. Sarah Chen covered her face with her hands, unable to bear hearing what she knew was coming next, but unable to leave the room either. You know what his first reaction was when Mum told him about the cancer diagnosis? Tommy asked, his voice rising slightly with suppressed rage. He didn't ask if she was scared. He didn't ask what he could do to help her feel less alone. He didn't even hug her or tell her that everything was going to be okay. The first words out of his mouth were questions about how long the treatment would take and whether she'd be able to go back to work afterward. Jake Martinez made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, finally understanding why his friend had become so angry and withdrawn over the past few weeks. But even then, I told myself he was just in shock, Tommy continued, his voice growing quieter and more fragile. I made excuses for him, convinced myself that he was just processing the information in his own way, and that he'd be more supportive once the initial surprise wore off. Tommy wiped his face with the back of his hand, though no tears were visible. The emotional numbness he was displaying was somehow more disturbing than crying would have been. The next morning, Rick seemed more like himself, Tommy said. He made Mom breakfast in bed, held her hand while they talked about treatment options, promised her that we'd get through it together as a family. He told her not to worry about money because that's what family is for, and that his job provided good health insurance that would cover most of the medical expenses. The pause that followed was filled with dread. Everyone in the room could sense that the story was about to reach its devastating climax, but no one was prepared for the full impact of what Tommy was about to reveal. The surgery was scheduled for a week later, Tommy continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, but carrying clearly in the absolute silence of the room. Rick took time off work to drive Mom to the hospital. He held her hand while the nurses prepped her for surgery, kissed her forehead, and told her he loved her before they wheeled her into the operating room. I honestly thought we were going to be okay. Tommy's composure finally began to crack, his voice breaking slightly as he reached the heart of his story. The surgery went well. The doctors removed the tumor and several lymph nodes, and they said they'd gotten all the cancer they could see. Mom's prognosis was good. Not easy, but good. She was going to need months of chemotherapy to make sure any remaining cancer cells were destroyed. But the doctors were optimistic about her chances of complete recovery. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he spoke, but his voice remained steady with the determination of someone who had decided that the truth needed to be told, regardless of how much it hurt to tell it. Tommy's voice grew even quieter, more fragile, as he approached what was clearly the most devastating part of his experience. For 4 days after Mum came home from the hospital, everything seemed normal. Rick took care of her. I helped as much as I could between school and my part-time job, and we started to settle into a routine that would work during her recovery period. The silence that followed was complete and terrible. Everyone in the room could sense what was coming, but no one wanted to hear it. On the 5th day, Tommy said, his voice now barely audible but somehow carrying to every corner of the classroom, I came home from school and found Rick packing his clothes into suitcases. Not talking to Mum about it, not explaining what he was doing, just systematically emptying his dresser drawers and closet like he was checking out of a hotel room. Tommy's voice broke completely on these words, the memory clearly as vivid and painful as if it had happened that morning rather than weeks ago. I asked him what he was doing, Tommy continued through his tears, and he said he couldn't handle it. Couldn't handle seeing Mum sick and weak, couldn't handle the medical bills and the uncertainty of not knowing how long her treatment would take, couldn't handle the possibility that she might never be completely healthy again. Around the classroom, students stared at Tommy in horror and disbelief, struggling to process the cruelty and cowardice he was describing. Tommy wiped his face again, smearing tears across his cheek, but continuing to speak with unflinching honesty. You know what he said to me? He said he was sorry, but that he'd gotten into this relationship expecting a healthy partner and a normal family life. He said he hadn't signed up for months of caregiving and medical crises and financial stress. He said he hoped I would understand that he needed to take care of himself first. The words hung in the air like physical blows. Several students were sobbing openly now, overwhelmed by the casual cruelty Tommy was describing. Jake Martinez was crying now, finally understanding the magnitude of his friend's loss and the reasons behind his recent behavior. Tommy's anger was fully visible now, his face flushed with rage and his hands shaking with the effort of containing his emotions. Do you know what it's like to watch your mother, who's just been through cancer surgery, read a note from the man she trusted explaining why she's not worth sticking around for? Do you know what it's like to hold your mom while she cries herself to sleep, not just because she's scared about the cancer, but because the person she counted on most proved that her worst fears about being unlovable were true? The question was directed at the entire room, but no one attempted to answer it. The pain in Tommy's voice was so raw and immediate that it seemed to fill the space between them all. Mr. Davidson, who had been listening in silence throughout Tommy's entire story, finally spoke. "Tommy, I'm so sorry. What Rick did to you and your mother was unconscionable. No one should have to deal with that kind of betrayal, especially not when facing a medical crisis." Tommy looked at him with something that might have been gratitude mixed with exhaustion. "The thing is, I'm not even surprised anymore. I should have expected it, right? I should have learned from my biological father that men who make promises about family are usually lying, even when they don't know it yet." He turned to face the entire class, his expression challenging them to judge him for his cynicism. "So now you know why I don't believe in your literary heroes, Mr. Davidson. Now you understand why I think people who talk about loyalty and commitment and never giving up are just telling themselves comfortable lies. In the real world, when love becomes inconvenient or expensive or difficult, most people choose themselves over the people they claim to care about." The silence that followed was profound and heartbreaking. Everyone in the room was processing not just the specific details of Tommy's story, but what it revealed about the kind of pain and abandonment that could drive someone to push away all offers of help and connection. Sarah Chen was the first to speak, her voice thick with tears. "Tommy, I had no idea what you were dealing with. I'm so sorry for not understanding why you were acting the way you were." "Don't apologize," Tommy said, his anger deflating into exhaustion. "You couldn't have known. I made sure nobody could know because I learned a long time ago that people feel sorry for you when your problems are small and manageable. But they disappear when your problems are big enough to actually inconvenience them." Marcus Williams raised his hand tentatively. "Tommy, how is your mom doing now? Is she okay?" Tommy's expression softened when he talked about his mother. "She's fighting. The chemotherapy makes her really sick, but she's tougher than Rick ever gave." The teacher who changed everything. Tommy Tuberville's story. The transformation in room 204 didn't happen overnight, but it began immediately. After Tommy's revelation, something had shifted in the classroom dynamic that went far beyond typical teacher-student relationships. Word of Tommy's situation spread through Jefferson High in the way that important news travels in small communities, quietly, respectfully, but thoroughly. By the end of the week, Mr. Davidson's desk had become an informal collection point. Sarah Chen organized a meal train, coordinating with other students' families to provide dinners for Tommy and his mother. Marcus Williams, inspired by Tommy's courage in sharing his story, had opened up about his own family struggles, creating a support network among students who had previously felt isolated by their circumstances. The change in Tommy was gradual, but undeniable. He still arrived to class with the same worn leather jacket and guarded expression, but he was arriving on time. When Mr. Davidson asked questions about the literature they were studying, Tommy participated in discussions with insights that surprised everyone, including himself. His intelligence, previously channeled into disruption and rebellion, now contributed to thoughtful analysis of characters and themes that resonated with his lived experience. Mr. Davidson nodded approvingly. "That's a mature observation, Tommy. What made you think about it that way?" Tommy shrugged, but there was less defensiveness in the gesture than there used to be. "I guess when you're living it, you realize that real courage isn't about dramatic speeches or sword fights. It's about getting up every morning and taking care of your responsibilities, even when you don't feel strong enough." Sarah Chen raised her hand. "Is your mom doing better with the treatments?" "Some days are good. Some are rough," Tommy admitted. "But she's fighting, and she's not doing it alone anymore." The anymore carried weight beyond Tommy's words. The Jefferson High community had quietly rallied around the Tuberville family in ways that restored some of Tommy's faith in human decency. Mrs. Rodriguez from the front office had helped Tommy apply for financial aid and work-study programs. Coach Patterson had found Tommy a part-time job maintaining the athletic fields that he could do after school. Even some of his former victims of classroom disruption had stepped up. Jake Martinez had started giving Tommy rides to school when his mother was too sick to drive, and several other students had formed an informal tutoring group to help him catch up on assignments he'd missed during his worst behavioral periods. "Tommy, I want to talk to you after class," Mr. Davidson said one December afternoon as students packed up their belongings. Tommy's old instincts kicked in briefly, that familiar surge of anxiety that came whenever authority figures singled him out. But he'd learned to recognize these moments now, to pause and consider whether his fear was based on past experience or present reality. As the classroom emptied, Tommy approached Mr. Davidson's desk with cautious curiosity rather than defensive anger. "Am I in trouble?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was asking more out of habit than genuine concern. Mr. Davidson smiled. "Quite the opposite. I wanted to talk to you about something I think you might find interesting. Have you ever considered peer counseling?" Tommy blinked in surprise. "Like helping other kids with problems?" "Exactly. Mrs. Patterson in the guidance office mentioned that they're looking for students to train as peer counselors, kids who can relate to what other students are going through and help them navigate difficult situations." "Your name came up." "My name came up? Are you sure you have the right person? I'm the kid who spent the first half of the semester making everyone's life miserable." Mr. Davidson leaned back in his chair. "You're also the kid who had the courage to be vulnerable in front of his classmates, who's been quietly helping Marcus Williams deal with his family situation, and who's shown more emotional insight in the past month than most adults show in a lifetime. Your experiences, difficult as they've been, have given you wisdom that could help other students who are struggling." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected turn. What would it involve? Training sessions on listening skills, conflict resolution, crisis intervention. You'd work with guidance counselors to help students who are dealing with family problems, academic stress, social issues, the kind of problems you understand better than most. "I don't know," Tommy said slowly. "What if I mess up? What if someone tells me about something serious and I don't know how to help them?" "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course, but I hope you'll seriously consider it. You've turned your pain into wisdom, Tommy. That's a rare gift, and one that could make a real difference in other people's lives." As Tommy walked to his after-school job, he found himself thinking about the conversation. 6 months ago, if someone had suggested he could help other people with their problems, he would have laughed bitterly. He'd been drowning in his own issues, lashing out at anyone who tried to help. But now, having experienced what it meant to have a community rally around him, he understood the power of connection and support. That evening, as he sat with his mother while she rested between chemotherapy treatments, Tommy brought up the conversation. "Mr. Davidson thinks I should become a peer counselor," he told her, stirring the soup Sarah Chen's mother had sent over. Help other kids who are dealing with family stuff." His mother smiled, though she looked tired. "What do you think about that?" "I think it's crazy. I'm still figuring out my own life. How can I help someone else with theirs?" Tommy considered her words. "Are you saying I should do it?" "I'm saying that pain can either make us bitter or it can make us compassionate. You've chosen compassion, Tommy. That's something to be proud of." The next morning, Tommy found Mr. Davidson before first period. "I want to do the peer counseling training," he said without preamble. Mr. Davidson looked up from his lesson plans, pleased but not surprised. "What changed your mind?" "My mum said something about how pain can make you bitter or compassionate. And I realized that for the first time in my life, I'm not bitter anymore. I'm angry about what happened to us and I'm sad about it, but I'm not bitter, and maybe that's something worth sharing. I think you're going to be excellent at this, Tommy. Maybe, or maybe I'll be terrible and traumatize some poor kid who just needs someone to listen to them complain about homework." Mr. Davidson laughed. "I doubt that, but even if you struggle at first, that's okay. Learning to help others is a process, just like everything else worth doing." Over the following weeks, as Tommy began his peer counseling training, he discovered that Mr. Davidson was right. His experiences had given him insights that proved valuable in helping other students. When a freshman girl broke down crying because her parents were getting divorced, Tommy knew exactly what to say because he'd felt that same helpless confusion. When a senior boy admitted he was afraid to apply to colleges because he didn't want to leave his struggling single mother alone, Tommy understood the guilt and responsibility that came with being the man of the house, too young. The transformation extended beyond just Tommy. Mr. Davidson's classroom had become a safe space where students felt comfortable sharing their struggles and supporting each other. Literature discussions became opportunities to explore how fictional characters' journeys related to real-life challenges. The class had developed a culture of empathy and mutual support that surprised even Mr. Davidson with its depth and authenticity. "You know what's funny?" Tommy said to Mr. Davidson after class one day, as they cleaned up from a particularly intense discussion about resilience in literature. "I spent so much energy trying to prove that people always leave. But the truth is, some people do leave. Rick left, my dad left, Mrs. Henderson left, but some people stay. You stayed, Sarah stayed, Marcus stayed, my mom stayed, even when staying was hard." Mr. Davidson nodded, putting the last of the books away. "What did you learn from that? That the ones who stay aren't necessarily better people than the ones who leave. They're just the ones who stay. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the point isn't to find people who will never leave or never hurt you. Maybe the point is to find the people who will stick around long enough for it to matter." "That sounds like wisdom, Tommy." "Yeah. Well, I had some good teachers." The boy who had once been convinced that heroes were fiction had learned something important. Heroes weren't fictional characters who appeared in moments of crisis and then disappeared when the story ended. Real heroes were people who showed up day after day, who stayed present in the midst of difficulty, and who had the courage to keep their hearts open even after they'd been broken. Tommy Tuberville had become one of those heroes, though he still wouldn't have described himself that way. He was just a kid who had learned to carry his pain with dignity, to accept help when it was offered, and to extend that same help to others who needed it. In a world that could be cruel and unpredictable, he had found something worth believing in, the possibility that people could choose to be present for each other, especially in the moments when presence mattered most. And in Mr. Davidson's classroom, that belief had become more than just a possibility. It had become a living reality that would continue to grow and spread, one student at a time, one story at a time, one moment of authentic human connection at a time. The story that had begun with a teacher yelling at Tommy Tuberville in front of the class had become something much more powerful. a testament to the transformative power of vulnerability, community, and the courage to keep believing in people even after some of them have let you down. It was a story that would be remembered long after that semester ended, not because it had a perfect happy ending, but because it had something more valuable: truth, hope, and the kind of authentic human connection that makes all the difference in the world.